Hi, Jeff again here. Another of the videos on the Working with German series, especially about Hofstede and all, and their traits. The whole concept here of the traits, that the six dimensions that are the six dimensions for a national culture, right? Or of a national culture, and and this one is about how about indulgence versus restraint. This is really interesting. Um, Again, all these are interesting, and this one is it's interesting. I usually refer this to as temporal ephemeral enjoyment versus um, doing what you have to do, right? Because you have to. Um, and this falls into the whole thing of obeying, the whole thing of the whole thing of behavioral constructs, behavior and following norms and all that. So the indulgence versus restraint. So indulgence is, I usually use an example here. I got to use examples. So the French are a great example of indulgence, right? Because they love everything you spend money on that's just for a short term food, right? They're into the meals, right? The enjoyment, the vacations, everything that's short term. The French are really into that, and they talk about it all the time. Talking about it all the time. Even at work, they're talking about the next vacation. At the while they're on vacation, talking about the next vacation. While they're on, while they're on the on at a meal, they're talking about the next meal they're going to have. So they're already thinking about the next one. The French are really indulgent, so I'll talk about that in indulgent and about we'll get the French, right? But I got to use this example to understand how the restraint part. The Germans are into compliance, mandatory governance. Compliance, mandatory governance. Um, these words are used all the time. It's like it's a culture made with words that are all based upon constraint and restraint. Everything is. You are handcuffed in doing a process, right? Um, and and you must do the process, right? So you don't have a choice. And we've been talking about this throughout this video series, all these things. So this is just another view, another angle of the view on the whole thing. These are not separate points. They're actually categories that all kind of cross slice each other, right? So the whole restraint thing is, I mean, here what's stated here, and I'm going to talk about that, is the whole high thing of indulgence. It stands for a society that allows relatively free gratification of basic and natural human drives related to enjoying life and having fun. The French, and actually all Mediterranean folks, right? In fact, if you think about it, a lot of cultures that live on on the on the all the equatorial areas, okay, so the equator, especially around the Mediterranean and even South America, it's kind of similar, right? So I think of Brazilians. It's there's not much constraint. And you think of a lot of Africans too that are kind of into this too, right? But here it's all about the Germans are all about having all the checklists and the things and the processes that drive everybody else crazy. It just drives everybody else crazy. Okay? And and a lot of times when I've done things like I'll give an example here when I did the ICE 9000 stuff with my job. It's a kind of a boring topic, right? And it's very mandatory on that stuff. But with the Germans, when they came here and they're looking at how I do it, they said, "What are you doing? This is like everybody loves this thing. They shouldn't be loving Ice 9000 and all this process stuff. What are you doing to make them like this thing?" And so I gamified it because I got to make the French like to love it. Because if you just use the word compliance and mandatory, the French won't like it. So they won't want to do it. You don't want them to hate it, right? So I've gamified it and made it fun, so they actually like to do it. Where the Germans don't the German auditors were just not get. They were saying, "What are you doing? This is crazy." They're talking about it. They're loving it. So so the whole thing of the indulgence thing, I used gamification for indulgence for people that are indulgence for that. But when you talk to the Germans, then when you talk about, you got to use all these mandatory words, right? So So then it's all about restraint, right? And restraint is the low thing in this one is, or the low end of the spectrum, or the spectrum, right? It's not really the low end. It's just one side of the spectrum. It stands for a society that suppresses gratification of needs and regulates it by means of strict social norms. Regulates. Hey, that's another word. Hey, regulatory affairs. It just sounds so German, right? Um, and strict social norms. And yeah, I mean, um, it's funny how a lot of Germans see me as a cowboy because I kind of do things the way I want to, right? But I do things in practical ways that actually get results done, right? Rather than sitting and following a process, because half the time the process doesn't exist. There is no process. I got to invent it. So, and it just is not there. There's nothing to do it. Half the three quarters of the stuff I do has no process. I have to create it. Um, so it's that's where working in a big company versus a small company. A lot happens too, and what the size of your or institution that you're at. Um, Germans are really respect people in big companies, big institutions because they have got a lot of processes, right? Now, I'm sure that a lot of Germans that work in small retail do not. They've got to survive elsewhere. Otherwise, it's not because of how many checklists they have, right? Because checklists don't bring in money, right? It doesn't. You got to do it another way. Um, so I'm sure that there's this high respect for the big companies. They're always talking now. Germans are always talking about the big other companies. Always, right? Always focus on BMW, Porsche, and Mercedes, you know, Volkswagen, Alstom, big companies, right? Alstom might be French actually, but can't remember if Alstom's actually French or German. Um, but a lot of these big companies, right, that have heavy processes in place to actually do things for manufacturing, or everything has got a everything has a purpose. Everything has a purpose and a checklist and an order and a process. I mean, even in my company, I mean, the 14 years I've been here, there's always a process owner. You got to have a process owner. You can have a product owner, but you always have to have a process owner. Whereas in a lot of companies that work, that you don't care about that. You just do it, right? You just make it happen. And you got somebody kind of just responsible to make it happen, right? But you don't have to have a defined process owner to actually run that whole thing all the time. Whereas I've found a lot in the German, especially the big companies, you got to have the process owners, right? And a lot of the companies just don't worry about that, right? A lot of institutions, they don't worry about that part because it's not about the process. The process you define. In fact, you see a lot of. I can remember a lot of looking at have worked with the acquisitions and how the Canadians were. They're very DIY, just do it yourself. Very pragmatic, very practical approach. Don't sit there and don't ever overkill on something and make it too complicated because it'll be just way too hard to do, right? So, so that's the kind of stuff we're talking about here, right? This is the kind of stuff we're getting into. So, so that's the one on this one. And I don't want to go into it too much more because that's going to cover pretty much everything here. But we're going to kind of go now into now we'll we'll see how all these things kind of correlate, right? Across all these different things. So and then we'll wrap it up for a lot of these things, and at least for these cultural trait type things.